Welcome. This is VPR Catholic Media, episode 2 of our series on the saints. And today we're covering a few saints of July. We're looking at Saint Junipero Serra, Saint Pius the First, Pope, Saint Elizabeth, Queen of Portugal, and Saint Christopher. Today we're going to start off with Saint Junipero Serra, whose feast day is on July 10th. And he is a little controversial. And honestly, two different separate spheres of the political spectrum, you could say. On the one hand, you have the traditional Catholics who would say, well, he was canonized by Pope Francis. And the issue with this is that when he was canonized, Francis sort of jumped the traditional, if you could say even traditional, but the system that was in place, the canonical system, to approve him as a saint. And the issue with this is that he didn't have two miracles attributed to him. He had one attributed to him when he was a blessed, I believe, or that made him a blessed. And this was a nun who had lupus, and she was cured by the intercession of Saint Junipero Serra. But Saint Francis elevated the case of Serra, despite him not having an approved second miracle, even though there's reams of different possible miracles that the Vatican has not approved as, yes, this is incontrovertibly the hand of the intercession of Junipero Serra. So I can kind of understand that complaint. On the other hand, the deeds that Junipero Serra had accomplished as a missionary really puts him in league with, saints from oh gosh, why can't I think of them right now? But before, even around the time of Saint Anselm, going around converting the pagans of Europe, he certainly faced hostilities, and he had sort of a different milieu, a different. He was obviously a Spaniard and under the Spanish crown, but he really did some amazing work. So we're gonna go dive into him on I should mention, on the other side of the political spectrum. He's controversial in a ridiculous way. You might have seen his statues being torn down, or photos of red paint being splattered on it, and murderer and all this nonsense. Just claiming that putting the entire blame of the supposed, what Catholics know as the Black Legend, but this entire blame of supposed oppression of indigenous people on the shoulders of Junipero Serra. Which again is patently absurd. I think the case that is made most popularly for Junipero Serra in his defense of the natives is perhaps a little bit of a fudged narrative. They like to claim that he went all the way back to Mexico to visit the viceroy just to defend the natives, which isn't necessarily true. I wouldn't say that was his only motive. But that was a factor in it. He fought to get a particular governor, Governor Pedro Fages, who was a nuisance to him and an obstruction to what he wanted to do, and wasn't helpful in reining in his soldiers either, as far as abuses against the natives. And so Junipero Serra did request that white women be sent over, so that way the soldiers would have wives, and they wouldn't be abusing the natives sexually. So, the argument can be made for that. But in the grand scheme of things, the Spanish and the Catholic Church brought a level of civilization and culture to the New World that was on parallel to them, and something totally unseen. They went from having whatever native, foods were available to them in their own regions and through trade with groups that weren't hostile to them and enslaving them. Sorry. They went from that to having, cultivation, cows, herd animals, and crops like grapes, and all kinds of different processes and luxuries and civilization that they didn't have before. What they would have been without that, well, I think Montezuma is a good case for that. So let's kind of continue. Junipero Serra is known for his evangelization of Alta California, which, if you're not from California, which I'm an expat from California, myself. There was a mission chain established in the 18th century under the Spanish crown of Carlos III. That established 21 missions from San Diego to, Solano County, I believe it is, San Francisco Solano, sort of past San Rafael. And Junipero Serra played an instrumental role in this. He was born in 1713 in Majorca, Spain, and was really well studied. He eventually made his way to the New World when he was about in his 50s. And his mission work in that region, which he always longed to do, didn't begin until really the latter part of his life. A story that's told about him is in his travels, he was struck by an insect, a native insect of Mexico, and it really caused damage to his, leg and the nerves in his leg, and forever after that he limped. And then there's also another tale of him traveling with a pack train, and one of the donkey herders gave him this medicine that he used for his donkey. And so Junipero Serra prayed over it, and he used the medication, and it greatly improved his faculties with his leg. When the approval was, finally granted for Junipero Serra to have an expedition, he was joined by another priest. I can't think of his name right now, maybe Father Crispy. And also different captains and some soldiers, carpenters, a crew that would be able to build the missions, and continue their work. Captains Fernando Rivera and Gaspar de Portola are two notable ones. Gaspar de Portola, from my research, is really praised for his work, and without his, military leadership, things wouldn't have turned out the way they did. However, on the other hand, you had Fernando Rivera and Governor Pedro Fages, who became governor of Alta California, I mentioned before, who kind of abused the natives, or rather didn't really rein in their soldiers when abuses happened, and were kind of lax and lazy, and at least by the reports of Junipero Serra, were a real hindrance to his missionary work. Another character that is worth mentioning before we move on, I think, is the Viceroy Antonio Bucarelli of Mexico City, who was the viceroy in the story I mentioned before of Junipero Serra traveling all the way back to Mexico City to defend for the natives, which is true and not necessarily the primary reason he went. So anyways, we're going to continue. I want to look at a few of the requests that were granted, in particular, from Bucarelli when Serra traveled. The first was that Fages be deposed, and he, like I said, didn't rein in his soldiers, and was a hindrance to Serra in his missionary work. And a little more credence to the story, or the efforts of Serra to distance himself from the soldiers and help the natives, was that he had the presidios, which were the settlements where the soldiers were, moved away from the missions, where the work of enticing the natives to come and building the mission and sustaining the agricultural system and the lie and all that took place. So that is true. He also petitioned for soldiers to be granted more pay, as we said before, for white women to be sent so they could become the wives of the men. Excuse me. And also, probably pretty importantly, is a Presidio mission settlement to be created at San Francisco Bay, and this was in honor of the patron of the Franciscan order, Saint Francis. So one little side thing at this time I might mention is Carlos III. He banished the Jesuits, who before that time had gone to the New World and really been the primary group evangelizing the New World. And then when they were expelled, the Franciscans were put in place. And that is why Junipero Serra, actually a Franciscan, who went to Mexico City and began his work. He also, a request of Bucarelli, was to create a land trail for a pack train, because there were just some things that you couldn't, just ship by sea. You had to establish trails and roads between the missions. So this facilitated more missions being built along the way. As I mentioned before, he is a saint of controversy in the traditional category, which, I really am more of. I go to the traditional mass, but um, on the one hand, I do kind of agree with the sainthood and valor of Junipero Serra, just like Padre Pio, who was, canonized under John Paul II, under his new rules, which also he was canonized under after his death, which I think is absurd. So, there really needs to be a system put in place by a more sane pontiff and church and Vatican some way down the road to really put a better system of categorizing all these saints, which we'll kind of look at a little bit later. Because if you look at the origins of sainthood, we're just saying that we're believing, or the church is approving of the notion that a particular individual is in heaven. And this wasn't quite the beginning of sainthood. The first saints were martyrs. After that, confessors. And then, down the road, we get to John Paul II. Well, even before that, you get to the institution of how you declare one venerable and then beatified or blessed and canonized. As far as Junipero Serra is concerned, he was declared venerable by John Paul II and noted for his heroic virtue in 1985. He was blessed or beatified, which is the next step in the process, in 1987, when the single miracle of him healing a nun with lupus was approved. And so he needed one more miracle to be canonized or become a saint, which is the next step, the final step in the process. And Francis, I can't remember the name of the individual, but he's a scholar who's done a lot of research in the area of Spanish colonization and Alta California and Junipero Serra, and the case for Junipero Serra's canonization. Even admits that Francis had jumped the normal canonization process. So while it is abnormal, and Francis certainly is an abnormal pope, I myself, given my research on Junipero Serra, do consider him a valid saint. You can contest me on that. I'd be interested to see your points. Like I said, canonization, sort of a brief history. The earliest saints were martyrs, okay? And then around the 4th century, people that were, ascetics in the deserts and things like that were noted for their own extraordinary virtue. And they were sort of noted as non-literal saints, or non-literal martyrs, rather. They battled heretics in speech and in writing, and so in that way they shed their blood for the faith, but metaphorically they had shed their blood, whereas a martyr had actually died. So let's go ahead and move on, speaking of canonization, to Pope Pius I, who was the 10th pope in line after Peter. He succeeded Pope Hyginus, and his pontificate was from about 142 to 167. An interesting thing about him is there is a writing called The Shepherd, which is lost to us right now. But allegedly, his brother, Hermas, who wrote The Shepherd, claimed he was a slave in this particular really early Christian popular piece of literature. And this would lead one to conclude that Pius himself came from low origin. However, it is somewhat disputed because, it's possible his brother Hermas was using him being a slave as more of a literary device in his work. Can we prove this either way? No, because the work itself is lost. Mention of it is made in, I believe, Eusebius's church history. So make of that what you will. Marcus Aurelius, he was the pontiff under the reign of Marcus Aurelius. And what's interesting, another factoid about him, is a stational church. The stational church of Tuesday in the 3rd week of Lent at Santa Prudencia is held there. Uh, he's also buried next to Peter, or close to Peter, on the Vatican, which leads me to something I've been trying to research. I reached out to the cathedral of San Juan in Puerto Rico, I believe it is, regarding this. And allegedly, there are some remains of Pope Pius I that were taken in the 19th century over there. And there is actually a wax body, which I'll share an image here, of Pius housing his relics. Like I said, I reached out to this cathedral and I haven't heard anything back. If I do, I'll go ahead and share more on it. So, to me, it seems I'm a little incredulous, that the remains of Pius I would have been translated all the way from, about the year 150 to about the year 1850, then be transferred all the way over to this particular church. But, stranger things have happened. I just kind of want to see the evidence. There's allegedly a plaque over this wax body made of Pope Pius I, and it has some information about it. But like I said, I haven't received any information back, a photo of it, or the text to verify. I want to share a few more factoids because we don't know too much about Pope Pius the First, other than, he probably wasn't a martyr who shed his blood, but in a sense, he was a martyr because along with, I think the first 35 popes or so, they're all considered martyrs, even if they didn't shed their blood. But in, again, a metaphorical sense, he shed his blood in fighting, and he lived under a time of great persecution, with, few respites in between, until Christianity was approved and made official by Constantine. Some more factoids about the Pius line in and of itself. So Pope Pius I was the only Pope Pius until the 15th century. That's not until Pope Pius II took the name Pope Pius II. There's also a number of saints. Pope Pius I, of course, Pius V, who is associated with Lepanto and the battle against the Turks there to repel them from Europe, and which he was instrumental in, and of course Pope Pius X. So 3 popes who hold the saintly title. There's also a blessed Pius IX, venerable Pius XII, and a few anti-popes, or at least one anti-pope, because this led me on sort of a rabbit hole. Lucian Pavlmacher, who was anti-pope Pius XIII from 1998 to 2009. So he basically is a conclavist. So he sort of set himself up as pope under his own sort of conclave in 1998. Now, this was even after another individual who's still alive, anti-Pope Michael, goes by Pope Michael, who was elected again under a conclave of, consisting of his own parents at the time and very few numbers of people. It was mostly, according to him, a number of sedevacantists who weren't in opposition to the church or in the. You'll have to look up his own videos to hear his own words. It's really quite interesting. I've looked at a few of them just out of interest, and the anti-popes of our own time. Interesting subject. So moving on, I want to move on to another saint, Saint Christopher, who, at least in my own mind, maybe this is just my craziness, but I can note it in a piece of pop culture at least, has sort of been downgraded, or allegedly been downgraded from his role as saint, or even to the extent of saying that Saint Christopher never existed. And there is, Adam 12, the show with the 2 cops from what I think the 70s. I remember watching it one day, and one of the sergeants on it was saying something about how St. Christopher was removed he's not even a saint anymore, and he's sort of lamenting that in a small way. So this is sort of, a myth from what I've seen. He's certainly not been suppressed, I would say, but less elevated. He shares the same feast day, and he has shared the same feast day with St. James the Great, July 25th, for a long time. So the church, as it is of now, really is promoting more the cult or the feast of Saint James the Great on the 25th, but it's not ignoring, in a minor degree or a lesser degree, a mentioning of Saint Christopher. So let's go into a little bit about his legend because he's quite interesting. Saint Christopher was previously known by the name of Reprobus, and what he wanted to do, he had a quest to serve the most powerful king in the whole world, and so this led him all over. He was a Canaanite by birth. Um, Eventually, he got himself into the service of Satan. And one day, following along with Satan, they got to a road where a cross was affixed. And in horror, Satan turned and he traveled the other way. Saint Christopher, at this time Reprobus, questioned this, and the fear of Satan at the very sight of the cross made him wonder who was this Lord, who this, supposed great power of the world, this great prince of the world, was in fear of. So this led St. Christopher later to a hermit, and he asked this hermit, what must I do to serve this great king, this great powerful Lord? And the hermit told him, well, our Lord requires great fasting. And St. Christopher, being a large man, reported as being a giant of a man, he could not do this, basically. So he said, what else could I possibly do? And so the priest or the hermit told him that, to follow God, you must pray frequently. And, again, St. Christopher kind of scoffed. I can't do this. I'm a simple man. I don't have the intellect for that kind of a thing. So the hermit pondered, what more can he possibly do? And so he gave St. Christopher the objective of a work. And that work was to ferry pilgrims or individuals who wanted to cross a particular river on his shoulders across it. And there had been a lot of particular crossers who had drowned trying to ford this river. So St. Christopher agreed. And he did this for a long time. One day, a young child came to him, and the child asked to cross the river. So St. Christopher agreed. And as he was carrying him across the river, the weight began to grow greater and greater until he could hardly continue. He was up to his chin in water. Eventually, he finally forded the river exhausted. And he said to the boy, it felt like I had the whole weight of the world on my shoulders, boy. And the boy told him, well, I am the Lord. You did have the weight of the shoulders and me on your shoulders. So this is the great legend, and you can see a lot of artistic portrayals of St. Christopher fording the Christ child on his shoulders across the water. And there aren't too many saints who actually have the Christ child associated with them symbolically and in their imagery. Obviously, St. Joseph, the foster father of Christ. St. Anthony is also given that privilege. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I know there are sort of a few, but again, St. Christopher is one of the most notable. And what we do know about him, as I said before, was he was a Canaanite and he was murdered in about 250 AD. The aspects of his life that are legend, you can take them as pious stories or not. He is also considered one of the 14 auxiliary saints, or the holy helpers, who I mentioned in episode 1. What was that? Saint Vitus and his companions. So again, I'm going to delve into the 14 auxiliary saints or holy helpers at another time. But Saint Christopher is also the patron of pilgrims, and now in the modern day of those who travel, by airplane, by car. And again, he's not demoted from being a saint anymore. He is still in, he's not in the Roman martyrology, I believe, is the big issue. But he is still in the canon of the saint and canon of the saints in a way. And devotion to him is perfectly, fine. All right. Finally, we're getting to the last saint I wanted to touch on today, Saint Elizabeth of Portugal. And her feast day is July the 8th. She was born in 1271 of the House of Aragon. And an interesting fact about her is she is the grandniece of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, her namesake. Her father was King Pedro III and Queen Constanza of Naples. She was recognized as being pious throughout her entire life. Her father even noted as saying, that she would exceed all other women in beauty and grace. And indeed, in some ways, and even, uh, in more than legend, that's true. She was eventually betrothed to King Dennis of Portugal, who was sort of a rake, to say the least. He was an abusive husband, as far as, you know, eventually, sequestering the queen for his belief that she was involved in intrigue in a fortified city, and also, taking other illicit women with him, and having children with him, but having children with them. But Saint Elizabeth of Portugal, being a good wife, she actually took care of these illegitimate children, and eventually her example led to the conversion of King Dennis. She tended the poor and the elderly, and she built hospitals and orphanages and even bridges. She oversaw and designed all of these things, and she was actually made the patron. Let me just check here. I don't want to get it wrong. Of course, it's blocked off. She was made the patron of a scientific institute. I can't remember the name of it. I'll have to link it later. Anyways, the story about her reconciling her husband with her son, or illegitimate half son, is an interesting one, because her half son aligned himself with Alfonso. Sorry, his name was Alfonso. He aligned himself with the kingdom of Castile to overthrow his father. And Dennis, like I said, believing that she was intriguing against her, exiled her to the fortified city of Alenquer. Now, while here, she prayed and, didn't complain. Eventually, she was released. She was a third order of the Franciscans, and she wanted to be a nun, but she remained a tertiary her whole life. The incident about her husband's conversion goes as follows. There was a wicked page who was jealous of another page. We'll call him the good page. And what he did was he made up a story about some illicit behavior between the good page and Elizabeth. So the king, learning this, secretly ordered that the first page be brought to a lime furnace, or the first page that he ordered be sent to a lime furnace, be cast in there and killed. So this page, sent on his way, stopped into a church for mass. And this mass being only halfway done, he stayed for the second mass to get all the way through. In the meantime, the king had sent a second page, the wicked page, to go and verify that the first one had been killed. The wicked page was thrown into the furnace. Once the king learned of this, he was converted by seeing that God had saved the good page while punishing the liar. Another legend that I wanted to touch on was the legend of roses, which has two different stories that I've come across. One is that while overlooking the building of a hospital, she was given a bouquet by a girl at the work site. And so St. Elizabeth distributed these flowers to each worker. At the end of the day, these flowers turned into a gold coin. The other story is that her husband had forbidden her to give alms, and so she would secretly go out and distribute bread. And one day, suspecting of her behavior, the king followed, and when he went to see what she was distributing, when she opened up the blanket that was covering the bread, it was actually all just roses and flowers. So again, two different stories that I've come across as far as roses and her association symbolically with that. So that pretty much concludes everything that I wanted to talk about for today's episode on the Saints of July. So we have, thanks for being here. This is VPR Catholic Media, and we'll be back next month covering the month, August, the Saints of August. So sorry, it's been a long day. Didn't expect to be doing the live stream, but we went ahead and did it because things just worked out. So again, God bless VPR Catholic Media. Subscribe and like, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.